In the darkness of Fort Sumner, New Mexico, a young outlaw stepped into a bedroom and asked who was there. A sheriff was already waiting inside with a revolver in his hand. Seconds later, Billy the Kid was dying on the floor at roughly 21 years old. Few deaths better capture the difference between the Wild West of legend and the Wild West that actually existed. Billy the Kid was not born with that name. He was most likely born Henry McCarty, and he later used names including Henry Antrim and William H. Bonney. By his teens, he had already lost his mother and learned how quickly a young man could disappear into the borderlands of the American Southwest. His first known crimes were far less dramatic than the legend that later surrounded him. But New Mexico territory was sliding toward a violent struggle that would transform him from a drifting teenager into one of America's most famous outlaws. In 1878, the murder of English rancher John Tunstall helped ignite the Lincoln County War. Billy joined a group of armed men known as the Regulators, who claimed they were pursuing Tunstall's killers under legal authority. The conflict quickly stopped looking like law enforcement and began looking like open warfare between rival factions. Billy took part in gunfights and killings that placed his name permanently on the wrong side of the law. One of the most notorious episodes was the killing of Lincoln County Sheriff William Brady in the streets of Lincoln. By the end of the conflict, Billy was wanted for murder and living through a cycle of flight, negotiation, betrayal, and violence. New Mexico Governor Lew Wallace offered a possible path toward clemency if Billy cooperated as a witness in another case. Billy surrendered and testified, apparently believing a deal might eventually free him from prosecution. The arrangement collapsed, and Billy escaped custody, rather than wait for the political promise to become real. The manhunt tightened when Pat Garrett was elected sheriff of Lincoln County. Garrett captured Billy in December 1880, after a standoff at Stinking Springs. Billy was tried for Sheriff Brady's killing and sentenced to hang. Then, on April 28, 1881, he escaped from the Lincoln County Courthouse in spectacular fashion. Deputies James Bell and Bob Ollinger were killed during the escape. Billy vanished again into the New Mexico countryside, but this time Garrett knew the people and places that might shelter him. On the night of July 14, Garrett was questioning Pete Maxwell at Fort Sumner when Billy unexpectedly entered the dark room. The exact sequence comes largely through accounts shaped after the event, so some details remain debated. What is not seriously disputed is that Garrett shot Billy the Kid and that Billy died there that night. New Mexico records include official documents concerning the reward, the escape, the death warrant, and the verification of his death. The popular claim that Billy killed 21 men, one for every year of his life, belongs more to legend than to proven history. His real criminal career was violent enough without the arithmetic of dime novels. The most famous young outlaw in America died not in a grand street duel, but in a dark room where he did not know his enemy was waiting. The next outlaw became even more distorted by legend because newspapers turned a woman convicted of horse theft into the so-called bandit queen of the West. Her name was Belle Starr. Belle Starr was born Myra Maybelle Shirley in Missouri in 1848. The Civil War shattered the world around her family and placed her close to men who had learned violence during the conflict. She later married Jim Reed, an outlaw whose criminal life eventually ended when he was killed while resisting arrest. Belle's reputation grew through her associations with men connected to robbery, rustling, and the criminal networks of Indian Territory. In 1880, she married Sam Starr and settled near the Canadian River in the Cherokee Nation, at a place remembered as Younger's Bend. Their home became associated with fugitives and outlaw visitors, but the historical Belle Starr was not quite the criminal mastermind that sensational newspapers later advertised. The Oklahoma Historical Society notes that her only clearly documented crime was horse theft. Belle and Sam were prosecuted in federal court and served time after a horse theft conviction. That did not stop the press from building a far larger character around her. Dime novels dressed her in velvet, armed her like a frontier queen, and placed her at the center of crimes she may never have committed. Reality remained dangerous enough. Sam Starr was killed in a gunfight in 1886. Belle later married Jim July Starr and continued living in Indian Territory under a cloud of suspicion, rumor, and fame. On February 3, 1889, Belle was riding near her home when someone ambushed her. She was shot from behind and died before she could identify the attacker. The killing produced exactly the kind of mystery that turns history into folklore. Her son was suspected by some. Her husband was suspected by others. A neighbor named Edgar Watson was also drawn into the speculation. No one was convicted of her murder. Belle Starr was buried near Younger's Bend, while the question of who killed her remained unanswered. Her legend became far larger after her death than it had been while she was alive. The supposed bandit queen may have committed fewer documented crimes than many minor rustlers, yet she became one of the most recognizable outlaw names in America. The next man had no such problem proving that he was an outlaw, because one robbery alone brought his gang a fortune in freshly minted gold. His name was Sam Bass. Sam Bass arrived in Texas as a young man with no obvious destiny as a legendary criminal. He worked ordinary jobs, handled cattle, and became interested in horse racing. Then his life turned toward robbery. In September 1877, Bass and his partners attacked a Union Pacific train at Big Springs, Nebraska. Inside the express car was an extraordinary prize. The gang escaped with about $60,000 in newly minted $20 gold pieces, along with additional valuables. For men accustomed to small scores, it was a staggering haul. The money did not buy safety. The gang split up, and several of Bass's partners were soon killed while resisting arrest. Bass managed to return to Texas and formed another band. During the spring of 1878, the new gang robbed trains around North Texas. The robberies brought less money than Big Springs, but far more attention from law enforcement. Texas Rangers and local posses began hunting Bass across the state. The decisive betrayal came from inside his own circle. Gang member Jim Murphy became an informer and revealed plans for a robbery in Round Rock. On July 19, 1878, Bass and his men entered town without realizing that law officers were already watching. A confrontation erupted into gunfire. Deputy Sheriff A.W. Grimes was killed, outlaw Seaborn Barnes was killed, and Bass was badly wounded. Bass escaped the immediate fight but could not escape his injuries. The following morning, he was found helpless in a pasture north of town. He was carried back to Round Rock while the manhunt that had chased him for months came to an end. Sam Bass died on July 21, 1878. It was his 27th birthday. The man who had once ridden away with a fortune in gold died 2 days after a failed bank robbery that never even began. Songs and stories soon turned him into another romantic figure of the frontier. The law remembered something different, an armed robber whose last plan had been destroyed by an informer. The next outlaw was even younger when he reached the gallows, and his final walk drew thousands of spectators. His name was Crawford Goldsby, but the frontier knew him as Cherokee Bill. Cherokee Bill was born in 1876 and was still a teenager when he became entangled with violent outlaw gangs in Indian Territory. He became associated with the Cook Gang during a period when isolated stores, rail lines, travelers, and law officers were frequent targets. Newspapers rapidly built his reputation as a dangerous gunman. By the time federal marshals closed in, the name Cherokee Bill carried enough fear to attract both posses and reward hunters. The crime that ultimately placed him on the road to execution occurred during the robbery of a store in the Cherokee Nation. A man named Ernest Melton was killed. Federal prosecutors accused Cherokee Bill of the murder. Capturing him required a trap involving people he trusted. He was arrested, transported to Fort Smith, Arkansas, and brought before the federal court associated with Judge Isaac Parker. A jury convicted him of Melton's murder, and he was sentenced to death. But Cherokee Bill was not finished creating trouble from behind bars. On July 26, 1895, a pistol that had been smuggled into the jail reached him. During an attempted escape, he shot and killed guard Lawrence Keating. Gunfire exploded inside the jail as guards tried to force the prisoners back. More than 100 rounds were reportedly fired during the chaos. The escape failed. Cherokee Bill now faced a second murder conviction while his first case was still moving through appeals. The Supreme Court upheld the first verdict. March 17, 1896, became the final date. Thousands of people gathered around the Fort Smith gallows enclosure to witness the execution. Reports described Cherokee Bill as remarkably calm as the hour approached. He reportedly observed that one day was about as good as another to die. At 2:13 in the afternoon, the trap was opened. Crawford Goldsby was only 20 years old. The frontier had turned him into a feared outlaw, before he was old enough to build much of an adult life outside violence. His story also exposed a different West from the one Hollywood would later prefer, a world of federal courts, crowded jails, deputy marshals, appeals, and public executions. But no outlaw on this list understood publicity better than the man who comes next. Jesse James did not merely become famous after his crimes. He actively helped build his own legend while he was still committing them. Jesse Woodson James was born in Missouri in 1847 and came of age in a region torn apart by the Civil War. His family supported the Confederacy, and his older brother Frank joined guerrilla fighters operating in Missouri. Jesse followed into that brutal world as a teenager. He rode with Confederate guerrillas and participated in violence that blurred warfare, revenge, and murder. The Centralia Campaign of 1864 became one of the darkest episodes connected to the guerrillas with whom he served. When the war ended, the violence did not simply disappear. Former guerrillas carried weapons, grudges, loyalties, and combat experience into Reconstruction. Jesse and Frank James became connected to a wave of bank and stagecoach robberies. By 1869, Jesse's name had broken into public view after the robbery of the Daviess County Savings Bank in Gallatin, Missouri. The cashier was killed after Jesse apparently mistook him for the man who had killed guerrilla leader Bloody Bill Anderson. From that point forward, Jesse James was not just a criminal but a political symbol. Newspaper editor John Newman Edwards helped portray him as a Confederate avenger, resisting the post-war order. Jesse encouraged the image through letters to the press. The romantic story claimed that the gang behaved like Robin Hood. The historical record shows robberies, killings, terrified civilians, and stolen money, not a systematic campaign to give wealth to the poor. The James brothers joined forces with the younger brothers and created one of the most famous outlaw bands in American history. They robbed banks, stagecoaches, and trains across several states. In 1875, Pinkerton agents attacked the James family home while hunting the brothers. An explosive device killed Jesse's young half-brother and badly injured his mother. The raid deepened sympathy for the James family among supporters who already saw them through the politics of the Civil War. Then came Northfield, Minnesota in 1876. The attempted bank robbery turned into a disaster when armed townspeople fought back. Members of the gang were killed or captured, and the younger brothers ended up in prison. Jesse and Frank escaped, and eventually tried to live under assumed names. Frank increasingly wanted a quieter life. Jesse built a new gang and returned to robbery. By 1881, Missouri Governor Thomas Crittenden had placed powerful pressure on the remaining James organization. Jesse moved his family to St. Joseph under the name Thomas Howard. Two newer associates, brothers Robert and Charlie Ford, stayed close to him. Jesse did not know that Robert Ford had already discussed the reward for capturing or killing him. On April 3, 1882, Jesse was inside his own home with the Ford brothers. At some point, he turned his back. Robert Ford drew a revolver and shot him in the back of the head. Jesse James died at 34, without the final gunfight that generations of Western stories might have expected. The Ford brothers surrendered, were convicted of murder, and were quickly pardoned by Governor Crittenden. Instead of ending Jesse's legend, the shooting made it larger. A violent outlaw who had spent years cultivating his public image was suddenly recast by many admirers as the victim of a cowardly betrayal. The next gang leader survived ambushes, a massive gun battle, arrest, and even a jailbreak before returning home to see his family one last time. That decision helped kill Bill Doolin. Bill Doolin began as a ranch hand before drifting into the world of the Dalton gang. He participated in train robbery with the Daltons, but did not join their disastrous attempt to rob two banks at once in Coffeyville, Kansas. Most of the core Dalton raiders were killed or captured at Coffeyville in 1892. Doolin emerged from the wreckage and helped form another gang. The group became known by several names, including the Doolin Gang, the Dalton-Doolin Gang, and the Oklahombres. Its members robbed banks, trains, and stagecoaches across Oklahoma and Indian Territory. The gang's willingness to fight law officers made it especially dangerous. In September 1893, deputy marshals descended on the outlaw stronghold at Ingalls. The confrontation became one of the largest gun battles between lawmen and outlaws in the territory. Several men were mortally wounded as the gang shot its way out. For years, lawmen such as Bill Tilghman, Heck Thomas, and Chris Madsen kept cutting away at the gang. Doolin himself carried wounds and developed painful rheumatism. That physical weakness helped lead to one of the strangest arrests in Old West history. In early 1896, Doolin went to the resort town of Eureka Springs, Arkansas, seeking relief in the mineral baths. Deputy Marshal Bill Tilghman followed him there. Tilghman managed to confront and arrest Doolin without the enormous gun battle many people expected. Crowds gathered when the famous prisoner was taken to Guthrie. Then Doolin escaped. On July 5, 1896, prisoners overpowered guards and opened the jail. Doolin was free again. He went south for a time, but eventually returned to Oklahoma Territory to see his wife and child. Deputy Heck Thomas picked up the trail. Near Lawson on August 25th, Thomas and a posse set an ambush. The officers called on Doolin to surrender. Doolin turned and fired instead. The posse answered with a blast of gunfire. Bill Doolin fell dead on the road. His body was later displayed and photographed in Guthrie. The man who had escaped a federal jail survived only a matter of weeks after choosing to return to the country where the law knew him best. The next man was hanged by the law, but more than a century later, people still argue over whether the law hanged the right man. Tom Horn remains one of the most uncomfortable figures in the history of the American frontier. He had worked as a scout, interpreter, tracker, detective, and range investigator. He also developed a reputation as a man wealthy cattle interests could use when ordinary law enforcement was not enough. By the 1890s, disputes between large ranchers, small operators, homesteaders, and suspected rustlers had turned parts of Wyoming into a landscape of intimidation and killing. Horn was linked in public memory to that hidden violence. Exactly how many killings he committed is much harder to establish than later legend suggests. The case that ended his life centered on the death of 14-year-old Willie Nickel. The boy was shot near Iron Mountain, northwest of Cheyenne, in July 1901. Suspicion eventually focused on Horn. A lawman drew him into a conversation, while Horn had been drinking, and secretly recorded his words through a stenographer. Prosecutors treated parts of that conversation as a confession. Horn later insisted that he had been boasting and had not confessed to the murder. The case contained no direct physical evidence placing him at the shooting. Political pressure around the trial was intense. Horn was convicted in 1902. Even at the time, supporters argued that powerful interests wanted him silenced or used as a convenient scapegoat. Modern Wyoming historians continue to describe serious doubts about whether he killed Willie Nickel. That uncertainty did not stop the sentence. Horn spent his final months in the Cheyenne jail. On November 20th, 1903, he was led to a mechanically designed gallows. The trap was triggered by a system that used his weight and flowing water rather than a hangman pulling a lever. Tom Horn died by hanging. He may have been guilty of other acts of violence. But the specific murder for which Wyoming executed him remains one of the frontier's most disputed convictions. That makes his ending more disturbing than a simple outlaw shootout. The next man's death is even less certain, because his body was found alone beneath a tree, and the argument over what happened began almost immediately. Johnny Ringo became famous because he stood close to one of the most mythologized feuds in the history of the West. He had already been involved in violence in Texas before appearing in Arizona Territory. In Cochise County, Ringo became associated with the group loosely known as the Cowboys. That placed him on the opposite side of the political and personal conflict surrounding the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday. Ringo was not one of the men who fought at the OK Corral. Yet later stories repeatedly pulled him into the orbit of that gunfight because his connections made the legend irresistible. He did confront Doc Holliday in Tombstone, but the famous cinematic duel between them never happened. By 1882, Ringo was drinking heavily and was reported to be in a dark state of mind. On July 14th, a teamster found his body in Turkey Creek Canyon in the Chiricahua Mountains. Ringo was slumped near an oak tree. A gunshot wound had passed through his head. A revolver was found with him. A nearby resident reported hearing a single shot the previous day. The official conclusion was suicide. That should have ended the story. It did not. Some people who knew Ringo doubted that he had killed himself. Later claims blamed Frank Leslie. Others blamed Doc Holliday. Wyatt Earp eventually claimed involvement in Ringo's death as well. The problem is that the dramatic murder theories are much easier to tell than they are to prove. The surviving contemporary evidence supports the official suicide ruling more strongly than the movie versions do. But certainty is impossible. Johnny Ringo was buried close to the place where he was found. The man who became a symbol of the Tombstone underworld died with no confirmed witness, no final duel, and no answer powerful enough to kill the rumors. The next outlaw did not die alone. He was surrounded by gamblers in an El Paso saloon when another gunman walked up behind him. John Wesley Hardin had spent decades building the kind of reputation most men would have tried to escape. Hardin was born in Texas in 1853, the son of a Methodist preacher. Violence entered his life while he was still a teenager. At 15, he killed a black man after a confrontation and fled as Reconstruction authorities sought him. Hardin later claimed an extraordinary number of killings, although not every story he told about himself can be verified. Even skeptical accounts leave little doubt that he was one of the most dangerous gunmen of his era. He moved through Texas, cattle trails, gambling rooms, feuds, and frontier towns, while repeatedly colliding with the law. In 1871, he traveled north with cattle on the Chisholm Trail and passed through Abilene, Kansas. His later stories about confrontations with Wild Bill Hickok helped enlarge his own legend. Back in Texas, Hardin became entangled in the Sutton-Taylor feud. In 1874, the killing of Deputy Sheriff Charles Webb made him one of the most wanted men in the state. Hardin fled with his family and used false identities. Texas Rangers finally captured him in Pensacola, Florida, in July 1877. He was brought back to Texas and convicted of killing Webb. The sentence was 25 years in prison. Then Hardin did something few people expected. He studied while incarcerated. He read law. He participated in prison religious life. After his release in 1894, he was admitted to the bar. For a moment, one of the West's most notorious gunmen appeared to have transformed himself into an attorney. But the old world of gambling, guns, grudges, and dangerous acquaintances followed him to El Paso. Hardin became involved with the wife of one of his clients, Martin Mavroz. Muraz was later killed after returning from Mexico, and rumors connected Hardin to the officers involved. One of those officers was Constable John Selman. On August 19, 1895, Hardin was in the Acme Saloon rolling dice. Selman approached him from behind and opened fire. Hardin died instantly. The man who spent years insisting that he always faced danger with a gun in hand was killed before he could fight back. Selman went on trial, but the jury could not reach a verdict. Less than a year later, Selman himself was shot by Deputy Marshal George Scarborough and died after surgery. Hardin was buried in El Paso's Concordia Cemetery. His autobiography and the stories surrounding him continued to blur confession, self-justification, boasting, and frontier myth. His end was brutally simple. After surviving prison and trying to become a lawyer, he returned to a saloon culture where one enemy behind him was enough. The final outlaw became perhaps the most likable criminal legend of the Wild West, which makes the uncertainty around his death even more powerful. Butch Cassidy was born Robert Leroy Parker in Utah in 1866. He grew up in a large frontier family and learned ranch work before drifting toward theft. The name Butch Cassidy came later and helped separate the outlaw identity from the young man named Parker. Unlike some killers on this list, Cassidy developed a reputation for planning robberies while trying to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. That does not make the robberies harmless. Banks, payrolls, trains, employees, and passengers were still placed at gunpoint, so the gang could take money that was not theirs. Cassidy spent time in prison in Wyoming during the 1890s. After his release, he became the best-known figure in the loose group, later called the Wild Bunch. The gang used remote landscapes such as Robber's Roost in Utah and Hole in the Wall in Wyoming as refuges from law enforcement. Their robberies were built around preparation, horses, escape routes, and the vast distances of the American West. The Castle Gate payroll robbery in Utah helped make Cassidy's name even more famous. Train robberies brought the Wild Bunch national attention and relentless pursuit. Railroad companies and private detectives were adapting faster than the old outlaw world. Telegraphs, organized posses, identification photographs, and expanding rail networks made disappearing more difficult every year. Cassidy understood that the frontier was closing. In 1901, he left the United States with Harry Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid, and Etta Place. They settled for a time in Argentina and attempted to live as ranchers. For a few years, the story looked as if it might end, with two famous robbers quietly escaping the world that made them famous. Then pressure returned. Cassidy and Sundance abandoned the ranch and moved again through South America. By 1908, two American bandits generally identified as Cassidy and Sundance were operating in Bolivia. In November, the pair were linked to the robbery of a mining company payroll. The alarm spread through the region. Armed men and soldiers searched the roads. The fugitives reached the small mining settlement of San Vicente. There, they were surrounded in a house, and a gunfight began. By the next morning, both men inside were dead. Contemporary Bolivian reports described two American bandits killed after the payroll robbery. The conventional historical account identifies them as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, but no definitive forensic identification was made. No photograph of the bodies settled the question. Later stories claim that Cassidy survived, returned to the United States, and lived quietly under another identity. Researchers have spent decades testing those claims, and none has produced a universally accepted alternative ending. Even a grave once believed to hold Cassidy in Bolivia failed to provide the simple proof people wanted. So the most famous ending in Wild West cinema remains partly unresolved in real history. Butch Cassidy probably died in Bolivia in 1908, but the small space between probability and certainty has kept him alive in legend ever since. That is the strange pattern behind nearly every outlaw in this story. The West turned criminals into celebrities, violent deaths into folklore, and uncertain facts into stories that grew with every retelling. Billy the Kid died in a dark room. Belle Starr died in an unsolved ambush. Sam Bass died on his birthday after a robbery plan collapsed. Cherokee Bill died on a federal gallows at 20 years old. Jesse James died with his back turned to a man he trusted. Bill Doolin died after escaping jail and returning to see his family. Tom Horn died under a conviction historians still question. Johnny Ringo died beneath a tree with no witness to settle the mystery. John Wesley Hardin died at a gambling table after surviving decades of violence, and Butch Cassidy may have died thousands of miles from the American frontier he helped make famous. Which of these 10 endings surprised you the most, and which Wild West story should we investigate next?